Tonight, we journey back to 16th century Rome to unravel the Cenci, a crime so shocking it echoed through history. Prepare to discover the full, tragic story of abuse, murder, and justice, all while our soothing narration guides you to sleep. You click to learn about celebrated crimes, the Cenci, a 16th century crime that shocked Italy. And that's exactly what you'll get in this unique sleep audiobook by Alexandre Dumas. With calming red visuals and a voice designed for relaxation, you're not just getting history, you're getting a peaceful night's rest. But how did a noble Roman family become entangled in such a horrifying web of patricide? And what unspeakable acts drove a daughter, Beatrice Cenci, to such a desperate measure, forever sealing her fate? We'll explore these dark questions, providing the full, unadulterated account. If you're ready to uncover a truly unforgettable historical mystery and enjoy deep, restorative sleep, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more historical sleep. The Cenci, 1598. If you ever go to Rome and visit the Villa Pamphili, you will undoubtedly seek shade and coolness under its tall pines and along its canals. Then, you'll descend towards the Janiculum Hill on a charming road, where you'll find the Pauline Fountain. After passing this monument and lingering a moment on the terrace of the Church of St. Peter Montorio, which overlooks all of Rome, you will visit Bramante's cloister. In its center, sunk a few feet below ground level, stands a small temple, half Greek, half Christian, built on the exact spot where St. Peter was crucified. From there, you'll ascend by a side door into the church itself. There, an attentive guide will show you, in the first chapel to the right, the Christ scourged by Sebastian del Piombo, and in the third chapel to the left, an entombment by Fiammingo. Having admired these masterpieces at leisure, he will lead you to each end of the transverse cross, showing you a picture by Salviati on slate on one side, and a work by Vasari on the other. Then, pointing out a copy of Guido's Martyrdom of St. Peter, on the high altar with melancholic tones, he will recount how, for 3 centuries, the divine Raphael's Transfiguration was worshipped in that spot. He'll tell you how the French carried it away in 1809, and how the Allies restored it to the Pope in 1814. As you have probably already admired this masterpiece in the Vatican, allow him to elaborate. Search instead at the foot of the altar for a mortuary slab, which you will identify by a cross and the single word orate. Under this gravestone lies Beatrice Cenci, whose tragic story cannot but profoundly impress you. She was the daughter of Francesco Cenci. Whether or not it is true that individuals are born in harmony with their epoch, embodying its virtues or vices, it may interest our readers to quickly glance at the period just before the events we are about to relate. Francesco Cenci will then appear as the diabolical incarnation of his time. On August 11th, 1492, after the protracted death agony of Innocent VIII, during which 220 murders were committed in the streets of Rome, Alexander VI ascended the pontifical throne. Roderigo Lenzuoli Borgia, son of a sister of Pope Calixtus III, had 5 children by Rosa Venazza before being made cardinal. He later arranged for Rosa to marry a wealthy Roman. These children were Francis, Duke of Gandia; Caesar, Bishop and Cardinal, later Duke of Valentinois; Lucrezia, who was married 4 times. Her first husband was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, whom she left due to his impotence; the second, Alfonso, Duke of Bisiglia, whom her brother Caesar had assassinated; the third, Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, from whom a second divorce separated her; and finally, the fourth, Alfonso of Aragon, who was stabbed to death on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica and 3 weeks later strangled because he did not die soon enough from his nevertheless mortal wounds; Geoffrey, Count of Squillace, of whom little is known; and finally a youngest son, of whom nothing at all is known. The most famous of these 3 brothers was Caesar Borgia. He had made every arrangement a plotter could to become king of Italy upon the death of his father, the Pope. His plans were so carefully laid that he had no doubt of the success of this vast project. Every chance was accounted for, except one, which even Satan himself could hardly have foreseen. The reader will judge. The Pope had invited Cardinal Adrian to supper in his vineyard on the Belvedere. Cardinal Adrian was very rich, and the Pope wished to inherit his wealth, as he had already acquired that of the cardinals of Sant Angelo, Capua, and Medina. To achieve this, Caesar Borgia sent 2 bottles of poisoned wine to his father's cupbearer, without taking him into his confidence. He only instructed him not to serve this wine until he himself gave orders to do so. Unfortunately, during supper, the cupbearer left his post for a moment, and in this interval, a careless butler served the poisoned wine to the Pope, to Caesar Borgia, and to Cardinal Corneto. Alexander VI died some hours later. Caesar Borgia was confined to bed and sloughed off his skin, while Cardinal Corneto lost his sight and senses and was brought to death's door. Pius III succeeded Alexander VI and reigned for 25 days. On the 26th, he was also poisoned. Caesar Borgia controlled 18 Spanish cardinals who owed their positions in the Sacred College to him. These cardinals were entirely his creatures, and he could command them absolutely. As he was in a moribund condition and could make no use of them for himself, he sold them to Giuliano della Rovere, who was then elected pope under the name of Julius II. The Rome of Nero succeeded the Athens of Pericles. Leo X succeeded Julius II, and under his pontificate, Christianity assumed a pagan character. This, passing from art into manners, gave the epoch a strange complexion. Crimes momentarily disappeared, replaced by vices, but charming vices, vices in good taste, like those indulged in by Alcibiades and celebrated by Catullus. Leo X died after assembling, during his reign of 8 years, 8 months, and 19 days, such figures as Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Correggio, Titian, Andrea del Sarto, Fra Bartolomeo, Giulio Romano, Ariosto, Guicciardini, and Machiavelli. Giulio de' Medici and Pompeo Colonna had equal claims to succeed him. Both were skilled politicians, experienced courtiers, and possessed real and almost equal merit. Neither could obtain a majority, and the conclave was prolonged almost indefinitely, to the great fatigue of the cardinals. One day a cardinal, more tired than the rest, proposed electing, instead of Medici or Colonna, the son, some say of a weaver, others of a brewer from Utrecht, of whom no one had thought until then. He was at that moment acting head of affairs in Spain, in the absence of Charles V. The jest resonated with those who heard it. All the cardinals approved their colleague's proposal, and Adrian became pope by a mere accident. He was a perfect specimen of the Flemish type, a regular Dutchman, and could not speak a word of Italian. When he arrived in Rome and saw the Greek masterpieces of sculpture, collected at vast cost by Leo X, he wished to smash them, exclaiming, "Such ancient idols!" His first act was to dispatch a papal nuncio, Francesco Cenci, to the Diet of Nuremberg, convened to discuss Luther's reforms, with instructions that vividly illustrate the manners of the time. "Candidly confess," he said, "that God has permitted this schism and this persecution on account of the sins of man, and especially those of priests and prelates of the Church, for we know that many abominable things have taken place in the Holy See." Adrian wished to return the Romans to the simple and austere manners of the early Church, and with this objective, pushed reform to the minutest details. For instance, of the 100 grooms maintained by Leo X, he retained only a dozen, he said, to have 2 more than the cardinals. A pope like this could not reign long. He died after a year's pontificate. The morning after his death, his physician's door was found decorated with garlands of flowers, bearing this inscription: "To the liberator of his country." Giulio de' Medici and Pompeo Colonna were again rival candidates. Intrigues recommenced, and the conclave was once more so divided that at one time the cardinals thought they could only escape their predicament by doing what they had done before and electing a third competitor. They were even discussing Cardinal Orsini when Giulio de' Medici, one of the rival candidates, devised a very ingenious expedient. He needed only 5 votes. 5 of his partisans each offered to bet 5 of Colonna's supporters 100,000 ducats against 10,000 on the election of Giulio de' Medici. At the very first ballot after the wager, Giulio de' Medici secured the 5 votes he needed. No objection could be made. The cardinals had not been bribed. They had merely made a bet. Thus it happened, on November 18, 1523, Giulio de' Medici was proclaimed pope under the name of Clement VII. The same day, he generously paid the 500,000 ducats which his 5 partisans had lost. It was under this pontificate, and during the 7 months in which Rome, conquered by the Lutheran soldiers of the Constable of Bourbon, saw holy things subjected to the most frightful profanations, that Francesco Cenci was born. He was the son of Monsignor Niccolò Cenci, who later became apostolic treasurer during the pontificate of Pius V. Under this venerable prelate, who was far more occupied with the spiritual than the temporal administration of his kingdom, Niccolò Cenci took advantage of his spiritual head's detachment from worldly matters to amass a net revenue of 160,000 piasters, about £32,000 of our money. Francesco Cenci, his only son, inherited this fortune. His youth was spent under popes so absorbed with Luther's schism that they had no time to think of anything else. As a result, Francesco Cenci, inheriting vicious instincts and master of an immense fortune that allowed him to purchase immunity, abandoned himself to all the evil passions of his fiery and passionate temperament. 5 times during his profligate career, imprisoned for abominable crimes, he only secured his liberation by paying 200,000 piasters, or about 1 million francs. It should be explained that popes at this time were in great need of money. The lawless profligacy of Francesco Cenci first drew public attention during the pontificate of Gregory XIII. This era offered remarkable opportunities for a reputation such as the reckless Italian Don Juan seemed intent on acquiring. Under the Bolognese Buoncompagni, those who could pay both assassins and judges were given a free hand. Rape and murder were so common that public justice barely concerned itself with these matters, especially if no one appeared to prosecute the guilty parties. Gregory, in his easygoing indulgence, was spared to rejoice over the massacre of Saint Bartholomew. Francesco Cenci was at this time a man of 44 or 45 years old. He stood about 5 feet 4 inches in height, symmetrically proportioned, and very strong, though rather thin. His hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes were large and expressive, despite somewhat drooping upper eyelids. He had a long nose and thin lips, which habitually wore a pleasant smile, except when he perceived an enemy. At such moments, his features would contort into a terrible expression. On these occasions, or whenever moved or even slightly irritated, he was seized with a fit of nervous trembling that lasted long after the cause had passed. An adept in all manly exercises, especially horsemanship, he sometimes rode without stopping from Rome to Naples, a distance of 41 leagues. He would pass through the forest of San Germano and the Pontine marshes, heedless of brigands, even if alone and unarmed save for his sword and dagger. When his horse fell from fatigue, he bought another. If the owner was unwilling to sell, he took it by force. If met with resistance, he struck, always with the point, never the hilt. In most cases, being well known throughout the Papal States as a free-handed person, nobody tried to thwart him. Some yielded through fear, others from motives of interest. Impious, sacrilegious, and atheistical, he never entered a church except to profane its sanctity. It was said that he had a morbid appetite for novelties in crime, and that there was no outrage he would not commit if he hoped to enjoy a new sensation. At the age of about 45, he married a very rich woman whose name is not mentioned by any chronicler. She died, leaving him 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. He then married Lucrezia Petroni, a perfect beauty of the Roman type, distinguished by the ivory pallor of her complexion. This second marriage produced no children. As if Francesco Cenci were devoid of all natural affection, he hated his children and made no effort to conceal his feelings. On one occasion, while building a chapel dedicated to St. Thomas in the courtyard of his magnificent palace near the Tiber, he remarked to the architect, when instructing him to design a family vault, "That is where I hope to bury them all." The architect often later admitted that he was so terrified by the fiendish laugh accompanying these words that, had Francesco Cenci's work not been extremely profitable, he would have refused to continue. As soon as his 3 eldest boys, Giacomo, Cristoforo, and Rocco, were out of their tutor's hands, he sent them to the University of Salamanca to get rid of them. Out of sight, they were out of mind, for he thought no more about them, and did not even send them means of subsistence. In these dire straits, after struggling for months, the lads were obliged to leave Salamanca. They begged their way home, tramping barefoot through France and Italy, until they returned to Rome, where they found their father harsher and more unkind than ever. This occurred in the early part of the reign of Clement VIII, a pope famed for his justice. The 3 youths resolved to apply to him for an allowance from their father's immense income. They traveled to Frascati, where the Pope was building the beautiful Aldobrandini villa, and presented their case. The Pope acknowledged the justice of their claims and ordered Francesco to allow each of them 2,000 crowns a year. Francesco tried every possible means to evade this decree, but the Pope's orders were too stringent to be disobeyed. Around this time, he was imprisoned for a third time for infamous crimes. His 3 sons again petitioned the Pope, alleging that their father dishonored the family name and praying that the extreme rigor of the law, a capital sentence, should be enforced. The Pope denounced this conduct as unnatural and odious, driving them with ignominy from his presence. As for Francesco, he escaped, as on the 2 previous occasions, by paying a large sum of money. It is readily understood that his sons' conduct on this occasion did not improve their father's disposition toward them. However, as their independent pensions allowed them to keep out of his way, his rage fell with even greater intensity on his 2 unhappy daughters. Their situation soon became so intolerable that the elder, contriving to elude the close supervision under which she was kept, forwarded a petition to the Pope. She related the cruel treatment to which she was subjected and prayed to His Holiness either to give her in marriage or place her in a convent. Clement VIII took pity on her, compelled Francesco Cenci to give her a dowry of 60,000 crowns, and married her to Carlo Gabrielli, of a noble family of Gubbio. Francesco was driven nearly frantic with rage when he saw this victim released from his clutches. About the same time, death relieved him of 2 other encumbrances. His sons Rocco and Cristoforo were killed within a year of each other. Cristoforo by a bungling medical practitioner whose name is unknown, and Rocco by Paolo Corso di Massa in the streets of Rome. This came as a relief to Francesco, whose avarice pursued his sons even after their death, for he intimated to the priest that he would not spend a farthing on funeral services. They were accordingly borne to the paupers' graves he had prepared for them. When he saw them both interred, he cried out that he was well rid of such good-for-nothing children. He added that he would only be perfectly happy when the remaining 5 were buried with the first 2, and that when he had rid himself of the last, he himself would burn down his palace as a bonfire to celebrate the event. But Francesco took every precaution against his second daughter, Beatrice Cenci, following the example of her elder sister. She was then a child of 12 or 13 years old, beautiful and innocent as an angel. Her long fair hair, a beauty so rarely seen in Italy that Raphael, believing it divine, appropriated it for all his Madonnas, curtained a lovely forehead and fell in flowing locks over her shoulders. Her azure eyes bore a heavenly expression. She was of middle height, exquisitely proportioned, and during the rare moments when a gleam of happiness allowed her natural character to display itself, she was lively, joyous, and sympathetic, yet also evinced a firm and determined disposition. To ensure her custody, Francesco kept her shut up in a remote apartment of his palace, the key of which he kept in his own possession. There, her unnatural and inflexible jailer daily brought her some food. Up to the age of 13, which she had now reached, he had behaved to her with the most extreme harshness and severity. But now, to poor Beatrice's great astonishment, he all at once became gentle and even tender. Beatrice was no longer a child. Her beauty expanded like a flower, and Francesco, a stranger to no crime, however heinous, had marked her for his own. Brought up as she had been, uneducated, deprived of all society, even that of her stepmother, Beatrice knew not good from evil. Her ruin was comparatively easy to accomplish. Yet Francesco, to achieve his diabolical purpose, employed all means at his command. Every night she was awakened by a concert of music that seemed to come from paradise. When she mentioned this to her father, he left her in this belief, adding that if she proved gentle and obedient, she would be rewarded by heavenly sights as well as heavenly sounds. One night it came to pass that as the young girl was reposing, her head supported on her elbow, and listening to a delightful harmony, the chamber door suddenly opened, and from the darkness of her own room, she beheld a suite of apartments brilliantly illuminated and sensuous with perfumes. Beautiful youths and girls, half-clad, such as she had seen in the pictures of Guido and Raphael, moved to and fro in these apartments, seeming full of joy and happiness. These were the ministers to the pleasures of Francesco, who, rich as a king, every night reveled in the orgies of Alexander, the wedding revels of Lucrezia, and the excesses of Tiberius at Capri. After an hour, the door closed, and the seductive vision vanished, leaving Beatrice full of trouble and amazement. The next night, she threw herself onto her bed without undressing. At the accustomed hour, the door opened, and the nocturnal spectacle reappeared. This time, Lucrezia Petroni was among the women who passed before Beatrice's door. Violence had compelled her to endure this humiliation. Beatrice was too far off to see her blushes and her tears. Francesco pointed out her stepmother, whom she had looked for in vain the previous evening. As she could no longer offer any opposition, he led her, covered with blushes and confusion, into the middle of this orgy. Beatrice witnessed incredible and infamous things. Nevertheless, she resisted for a long time. An inner voice told her this was horrible. But Francesco possessed the slow persistence of a demon. To these sights, calculated to stimulate her passions, he added heresies designed to warp her mind. He told her that the greatest saints venerated by the Church were the issue of fathers and daughters. In the end, Beatrice committed a crime without even knowing it to be a sin. His brutality then knew no bounds. He forced Lucrezia and Beatrice to share the same bed, threatening his wife with death if she disclosed to his daughter by a single word that there was anything odious in such an intercourse. So matters continued for about 3 years. At this time, Francesco was obliged to make a journey, leaving the women alone and free. The first thing Lucrezia did was to enlighten Beatrice on the infamy of the life they were leading. They then together prepared a memorial to the Pope, in which they laid before him a statement of all the blows and outrages they had suffered. But before leaving, Francesco Cenci had taken precautions. Every person about the Pope was in his pay, or hoped to be. The petition never reached His Holiness. The two poor women, remembering that Clement VIII had on a former occasion driven Giacomo, Cristoforo, and Rocco from his presence, thought they were included in the same prescription, and looked upon themselves as abandoned to their fate. When matters were in this state, Giacomo, taking advantage of his father's absence, came to pay them a visit with a friend, an abbot named Guerra. He was a young man of 25 or 26, belonging to one of Rome's most noble families. He possessed a bold, resolute, and courageous character, and was idolized by all the Roman ladies for his beauty. To classical features, he added blue eyes swimming in poetic sentiment. His hair was long and fair, with a chestnut beard and eyebrows. Add to these attractions a highly educated mind and natural eloquence expressed by a musical and penetrating voice, and one can form some idea of Monsignor the Abbot Guerra. No sooner had he seen Beatrice than he fell in love with her. For her part, she was not slow to return the young priest's sympathy. The Council of Trent had not been held at that time, consequently ecclesiastics were not precluded from marriage. It was therefore decided that upon Francesco's return, Abbot Guerra should demand Beatrice's hand from her father. The women, happy in their master's absence, continued to live on, hoping for better things to come. After 3 or 4 months, during which no one knew his whereabouts, Francesco returned. The very first night, he wished to resume his intercourse with Beatrice. But she was no longer the same person. The timid and submissive child had become a girl of decided will. Strong in her love for the abbot, she resisted prayers, threats, and blows. Francesco's wrath fell upon his wife, whom he accused of betraying him. He gave her a violent thrashing. Lucrezia Petroni was a veritable Roman she-wolf, passionate alike in love and vengeance. She endured all, but pardoned nothing. Some days after this, Abbot Guerra arrived at the Cenci palace to carry out what had been arranged. Rich, young, noble, and handsome, everything seemed to promise him success. Yet, he was rudely dismissed by Francesco. The first refusal did not daunt him. He returned to the charge a second time, and yet a third, insisting upon the suitability of such a union. At length Francesco, losing patience, told this obstinate lover that a reason existed why Beatrice could be neither his wife nor any other man's. Guerra demanded what this reason was. Francesco replied, "Because she is my mistress." Monsignor Guerra turned pale at this answer, although at first he did not believe a word of it. But when he saw the smile with which Francesco Cenci accompanied his words, he was compelled to believe that, terrible though it was, the truth had been spoken. For 3 days he sought an interview with Beatrice in vain. At length he succeeded in finding her. His last hope was her denial of this horrible story. Beatrice confessed all. Henceforth, there was no human hope for the two lovers, An impassable gulf separated them. They parted and bathed in tears, promising to love one another always. Up to that time, the two women had not formed any criminal resolution, and possibly the tragic incident might never have happened, had not Francesco one night returned to his daughter's room and violently forced her into the commission of a fresh crime. Henceforth, the doom of Francesco was irrevocably pronounced. As we have said, Beatrice's mind was susceptible to the best and the worst influences. It could attain excellence and descend to guilt. She went and told her mother of the fresh outrage she had undergone. This roused in the heart of the other woman the sting of her own wrongs. Stimulating each other's desire for revenge, they decided upon the murder of Francesco. Guerra was called into this council of death. His heart was a prey to hatred and revenge. He undertook to communicate with Giacomo Cenci, without whose concurrence the women would not act, as he was the head of the family when his father was left out of account. Giacomo readily entered into the conspiracy. It will be remembered what he had formerly suffered from his father. Since that time he had married, and the close-fisted old man had left him, with his wife and children, to languish in poverty. Guerra's house was selected to meet in concert matters. Giacomo hired a sbirro named Marzio, and Guerra a second named Olimpio. Both these men had private reasons for committing the crime, one being actuated by love, the other by hatred. Marzio, who was in Giacomo's service, had often seen Beatrice and loved her, but with that silent and hopeless love which devours the soul. When he conceived that the proposed crime would draw him nearer to Beatrice, he accepted his part in it without any demur. As for Olimpio, he hated Francesco because the latter had caused him to lose the post of Castellan of Rocco Petrella, a fortified stronghold in the kingdom of Naples, belonging to Prince Colonna. Almost every year, Francesco Cenci spent some months at Rocco Petrella with his family, for Prince Colonna, a noble and magnificent but needy prince, had much esteem for Francesco, whose purse he found extremely useful. It so happened that Francesco, being dissatisfied with Olimpio, complained about him to Prince Colonna, and he was dismissed. After several consultations between the Cenci family, the abbot, and the sbirri, the following plan of action was decided upon. The period when Francesco Cenci was accustomed to going to Rocco Petrella was approaching. It was arranged that Olimpio, conversant with the district and its inhabitants, should collect a party of 12 Neapolitan bandits and conceal them in a forest through which the travelers would have to pass. Upon a given signal, the whole family were to be seized and carried off. A heavy ransom was to be demanded, and the sons were to be sent back to Rome to raise the sum. But, under the pretext of inability to do so, they were to allow the time fixed by the bandits to lapse, at which point Francesco was to be put to death. Thus, all suspicions of a plot would be avoided, and the real assassins would escape justice. This well-devised scheme was nevertheless unsuccessful. When Francesco left Rome, the scouts sent in advance by the conspirators could not find the bandits. The latter, not being warned beforehand, failed to come down before the passage of the travelers, who arrived safe and sound at Rocco Petrella. The bandits, after having patrolled the road in vain, concluded that their prey had escaped. Unwilling to stay any longer in a place where they had already spent a week, they went off in quest of better luck elsewhere. Francesco had in the meantime settled down in the fortress, and to be more free to tyrannize over Lucrezia and Beatrice, sent back to Rome Giacomo and his 2 other sons. He then recommenced his infamous attempts upon Beatrice, and with such persistence that she resolved herself to accomplish the deed which at first she desired to entrust to other hands. Olimpio and Marzio, who had nothing to fear from justice, remained lurking about the castle. One day Beatrice saw them from a window and made signs that she had something to communicate to them. The same night Olimpio, who, having been Castellan, knew all the approaches to the fortress, made his way there with his companion. Beatrice awaited them at a window that looked onto a secluded courtyard. She gave them letters which she had written to her brother and to Monsignor Guerra. The former was to approve, as he had done before, the murder of their father, for she would do nothing without his sanction. As for Monsignor Guerra, he was to pay Olimpio 1,000 piastres, half the stipulated sum. Marzio, acting out of pure love for Beatrice, whom he worshipped as a Madonna, received from the girl a handsome scarlet mantle, trimmed with gold lace, with instructions to wear it for love of her. As for the remaining money, It was to be paid when the old man's death had placed his wife and daughter in possession of his fortune. The two Sperry departed, and the imprisoned conspirators anxiously awaited their return. On the appointed day, they were seen again. Monsignor Guerra had paid the 1,000 piastres, and Giacomo had given his consent. Nothing now stood in the way of this terrible deed's execution, which was fixed for September 8th, the day of the Nativity of the Virgin. However, Signora Lucrezia, being a very devout person, noticed this circumstance and would not be party to committing a double sin. The matter was therefore deferred until the next day, the 9th. That evening, September 9th, 1598, the two women, supping with the old man, mixed a narcotic with his wine so adroitly that, suspicious though he was, he never detected it. Having swallowed the potion, he soon fell into a deep sleep. The previous evening, Marzio and Olimpio had been admitted into the castle, where they had lain concealed all night and all day. As will be remembered, the assassination would have been effected the day before had it not been for the religious scruples of Signora Lucrezia Petroni. Towards midnight, Beatrice fetched them from their hiding place and took them to her father's chamber, the door of which she herself opened. The assassins entered, and the two women awaited the outcome in the adjoining room. After a moment, seeing the Sperry reappear, pale and nerveless, shaking their heads without speaking, they at once inferred that nothing had been done. "What is the matter?" cried Beatrice. "And what hinders you?" "It is a cowardly act," replied the assassins, "to kill a poor old man in his sleep. At the thought of his age, we were struck with pity." Then Beatrice disdainfully raised her head and, in a deep, firm voice, thus reproached them. "Is it possible that you, who pretend to be brave and strong, have not enough courage to kill a sleeping old man? How would it be if he were awake? And thus you steal our money. Very well, since your cowardice compels me to do so, I will kill my father myself, but you will not long survive him." Hearing these words, the Sperry felt ashamed of their irresolution, and, indicating by signs that they would fulfill their compact, they entered the room, accompanied by the two women. As they had said, a ray of moonlight shone through the open window, highlighting the tranquil face of the old man, the sight of whose white hair had so affected them. This time they showed no mercy. One of them carried two great nails, such as those portrayed in pictures of the crucifixion. The other bore a mallet. The first placed a nail upright over one of the old man's eyes. The other struck it with the hammer and drove it into his head. The throat was pierced in the same way with the second nail. Thus, the guilty soul, stained throughout its career with crimes of violence, was in its turn violently torn from the body, which lay writhing on the floor where it had rolled. The young girl then, faithful to her word, handed the Sperry a large purse containing the rest of the agreed sum, and they left. When they found themselves alone, the women drew the nails out of the wounds, wrapped the corpse in a sheet, and dragged it through the rooms towards a small rampart, intending to throw it down into a neglected garden. They hoped the old man's death would be attributed to his having accidentally fallen off the terrace on his way in the dark to a closet at the end of the gallery. But their strength failed them when they reached the door of the last room. While resting there, Lucrezia perceived the two Sperry sharing the money before making their escape. At her call, they came to her, carried the corpse to the rampart, and, from a spot pointed out by the women, where the terrace was unfenced by any parapet, they threw it into an elder tree below, whose branches held it suspended. When the body was found the following morning, hanging in the branches of the elder tree, everybody supposed, as Beatrice and her stepmother had foreseen, that Francesco, stepping over the edge of the terrace in the dark, had thus met his end. The body was so scratched and disfigured that no one noticed the wounds made by the two nails. The ladies, as soon as the news was imparted to them, came out from their rooms, weeping and lamenting in so natural a manner as to disarm any suspicions. The only person who formed any was the laundress, to whom Beatrice entrusted the sheet in which her father's body had been wrapped, accounting for its bloody condition with a lame explanation, which the laundress accepted without question, or pretended to do so. Immediately after the funeral, the mourners returned to Rome, hoping at length to enjoy quietude and peace. For some time, indeed, they did enjoy tranquility, perhaps poisoned by remorse, but ere long retribution pursued them. The court of Naples, hearing of the sudden and unexpected death of Francesco Cenci, and concealing some suspicions of violence, dispatched a royal commissioner to Petrella to exhume the body and make minute inquiries, if there appeared to be adequate grounds for doing so. On his arrival, all the domestics in the castle were placed under arrest and sent in chains to Naples. No incriminating proofs, however, were found except in the evidence of the laundress, who deposed that Beatrice had given her a blood-stained sheet to wash. This clue led to terrible consequences, for, further questioned, she declared that she could not believe the explanation given to account for its condition. The evidence was sent to the Roman court, but at that period it did not appear strong enough to warrant the arrest of the Cenci family, who remained undisturbed for many months, during which time the youngest boy died. Of the 5 brothers, there remained only Giacomo, the eldest, and Bernardo, the youngest but one. Nothing prevented them from escaping to Venice or Florence, but they remained quietly in Rome. Meantime, Monsignor Guerra received private information that, shortly before Francesco's death, Marzio and Olimpio had been seen prowling around the castle, and that the Neapolitan police had received orders to arrest them. The Monsignor was a most wary man, and very difficult to catch napping when warned in time. He immediately hired 2 other sbirri to assassinate Marzio and Olimpio. The one commissioned to put Olimpio out of the way came across him at Terni, and conscientiously did his work with a poniard. But Marzio's man unfortunately arrived at Naples too late, and found his bird already in the hands of the police. He was put to the torture and confessed everything. His deposition was sent to Rome, where he shortly afterwards followed it, to be confronted with the accused. Warrants were immediately issued for the arrest of Giacomo, Bernardo, Lucrezia, and Beatrice. They were at first confined in the Cenci palace under a strong guard, but as the proof against them becoming stronger and stronger, they were removed to the castle of Corte Sevella, where they were confronted with Marzio. But they obstinately denied both any complicity in the crime and any knowledge of the assassin. Beatrice, above all, displayed the greatest assurance, demanding to be the first to be confronted with Marzio. Her calm dignity affirmed his mendacity with such conviction that he, more than ever smitten by her beauty, determined, since he could not live for her, to save her by his death. Consequently, he declared all his statements to be false and asked forgiveness from God and from Beatrice. Neither threats nor tortures could make him recant, and he died firm in his denial, under frightful tortures. The Cenci then thought themselves safe. God's justice, however, still pursued them. The sbirro who had killed Olimpio happened to be arrested for another crime, and, making a clean breast, confessed that he had been employed by Monsignor Guerra to put out of the way a fellow assassin named Olimpio, who knew too many of the Monsignor's secrets. Luckily for himself, Monsignor Guerra heard of this opportunely. A man of infinite resources, he lost not a moment in timid or irresolute plans. As it happened that at the very moment when he was warned, the charcoal dealer who supplied his house with fuel was at hand, he sent for him, purchased his silence with a handsome bribe, and then, buying for almost their weight in gold the dirty old clothes which he wore, he assumed these, cut off all his beautiful cherished fair hair, stained his beard, smudged his face, bought 2 asses laden with charcoal, and limped up and down the streets of Rome, crying, "Charcoal! Charcoal!" Then, whilst all the detectives were hunting high and low for him, he got out of the city, met a company of merchants under escort, joined them, and reached Naples, where he embarked. What ultimately became of him was never known. It has been asserted, but without confirmation, that he succeeded in reaching France and enlisted in a Swiss regiment at the pay of Henry IV. The confession of the sbirro and the disappearance of Monsignor Guerra left no moral doubt of the Cenci's guilt. They were consequently sent from the castle to the prison. The 2 brothers, when put to the torture, broke down and confessed their guilt. Lucrezia Petroni's full habit of body rendered her unable to bear the torture of the rope, and on being suspended in the air, begged to be lowered, at which point she confessed all she knew. As for Beatrice, she continued unmoved. Neither promises, threats, nor torture had any effect upon her. She bore everything unflinchingly, and the judge Ulysses Muscati himself, famous though he was in such matters, failed to draw from her a single incriminating word. Unwilling to take any further responsibility, he referred the case to Clement VIII. The Pope, conjecturing that the judge had been too lenient in applying the torture to a young and beautiful Roman lady, took it out of his hands and entrusted it to another judge, whose severity and insensibility to emotion were undisputed. This latter judge reopened the whole interrogatory, and as Beatrice up to that time had only been subjected to the ordinary torture, he gave instructions to apply both the ordinary and extraordinary. This was the rope and pulley, one of the most terrible inventions ever devised by the most ingenious of tormentors. To make the nature of this horrid torture plain, we give a detailed description of it, adding an extract of the presiding judge's report of the case, taken from the Vatican manuscripts. Of the various forms of torture then used in Rome, the most common were the whistle, the fire, the sleepless, and the rope. The mildest, the torture of the whistle, was used only in the case of children and old persons. It consisted in thrusting between the nails and the flesh reeds cut in the shape of whistles. The fire, frequently employed before the invention of the sleepless torture, was simply roasting the soles of the feet before a hot fire. The sleepless torture, invented by Marsilius, worked by forcing the accused into an angular wooden frame, about 5 feet high. The sufferer was stripped, and his arms tied behind his back to the frame. 2 men, relieved every 5 hours, sat beside him and roused him the moment he closed his eyes. Marsilius claimed he had never found a man proof against this torture, but here he claimed more than he was justly entitled to. Farinacci stated that, out of 100 accused persons subjected to it, only 5 refused to confess, a very satisfactory result for the inventor. Lastly came the torture of the rope and pulley, the most in vogue of all, and known in other Latin countries as the strappato. It was divided into 3 degrees of intensity: the slight, the severe, and the very severe. The first, or slight torture, which consisted mainly in the apprehensions it caused, comprised the threat of severe torture, introduction into the torture chamber, stripping, and the tying of the rope in readiness for its application. To increase the terror these preliminaries excited, a pang of physical pain was added by tightening a cord around the wrists. This often sufficed to extract a confession from women or men of highly strung nerves. The second degree, or severe torture, consisted in fastening the sufferer, stripped naked and with hands tied behind his back, by the wrists to one end of a rope passed around a pulley bolted into the vaulted ceiling. The other end was attached to a windlass, by which he could be hoisted into the air and dropped again, either slowly or with a jerk as ordered by the judge. The suspension generally lasted during the recital of a Pater Noster, an Ave Maria, or a Miserere. If the accused persisted in his denial, it was doubled. This second degree, the last of the ordinary torture, was put into practice when the crime appeared reasonably probable, but was not absolutely proved. The third, or very severe, the first of the extraordinary forms of torture, was so called when the sufferer, having hung suspended by the wrists for sometimes a whole hour, was swung about by the executioner, either like the pendulum of a clock, or by elevating him with the windlass and dropping him to within a foot or 2 of the ground. If he withstood this torture, a thing almost unheard of, seeing that it cut the flesh of the wrist to the bone and dislocated the limbs, weights were attached to the feet, thus doubling the torture. This last form of torture was only applied when an atrocious crime had been proved to have been committed upon a sacred person, such as a priest, a cardinal, a prince, or an eminent and learned man. Having seen that Beatrice was sentenced to the torture ordinary and extraordinary, and having explained the nature of these tortures, we proceed to quote the official report. And as in reply to every question she would confess nothing, we caused her to be taken by 2 officers and led from the prison to the torture chamber, where the torturer was in attendance. There, after cutting off her hair, he made her sit on a small stool, undressed her, pulled off her shoes, tied her hands behind her back, fastened them to a rope passed over a pulley bolted into the ceiling of the aforesaid chamber, and wound up at the other end by a 4-lever windlass, worked by 2 men. Before hoisting her from the ground, we again interrogated her touching the aforesaid parricide, but notwithstanding the confessions of her brother and her stepmother, which were again produced, bearing their signatures, she persisted in denying everything, saying, "Haul me about and do what you like with me. I have spoken the truth, and will tell you nothing else, even if I were torn to pieces." Upon this we had her hoisted in the air by the wrists to the height of about 2 feet from the ground, while we recited a Pater Noster, and then again questioned her as to the facts and circumstances of the aforesaid parricide, but she would make no further answer, only saying, "You are killing me! You are killing me!" We then raised her to the elevation of 4 feet, and began an Ave Maria. But before our prayer was half finished, she fainted away, or pretended to do so. We caused a bucketful of water to be thrown over her head. Feeling its coolness, she recovered consciousness and cried, "My God! I am dead! You are killing me! My God!" But this was all she would say. We then raised her higher still and recited a miserere, during which, instead of joining in the prayer, she shook convulsively and cried several times, "My God! My God!" Again questioned as to the aforesaid parricide, she would confess nothing, saying only that she was innocent, and then again fainted away. We caused more water to be thrown over her. Then she recovered her senses, opened her eyes, and cried, "O cursed executioners! You are killing me! You are killing me!" But nothing more would she say. Seeing which, and that she persisted in her denial, we ordered the torturer to proceed to the torture by jerks. He accordingly hoisted her 10 feet from the ground, and when there we enjoined her to tell the truth, but whether she would not or could not speak, she answered only by a motion of the head indicating that she could say nothing. Seeing which, we made a sign to the executioner to let go the rope, and she fell with all her weight from the height of 10 feet to that of 2 feet. Her arms, from the shock, were dislocated from their sockets. She uttered a loud cry and swooned away. We again caused water to be dashed in her face. She returned to herself, and again cried out, "Infamous assassins! You are killing me, but were you to tear out my arms, I would tell you nothing else." Upon this, we ordered a weight of 50 pounds to be fastened to her feet. But at this moment the door opened, and many voices cried, "Enough! Enough! Do not torture her any more." These voices were those of Giacomo, Bernardo, and Lucrezia Petroni. The judges, perceiving Beatrice's obstinacy, had ordered that the accused, who had been separated for 5 months, should be confronted. They advanced into the torture chamber, and seeing Beatrice hanging by the wrists, her arms disjointed, and covered with blood, Giacomo cried out, "The sin is committed. Nothing further remains but to save our souls by repentance, undergo death courageously, and not suffer you to be thus tortured." Then said Beatrice, shaking her head as if to cast off grief, "Do you then wish to die? Since you wish it, be it so." Then turning to the officers, "Untie me," said she. "Read the examination to me, and what I have to confess, I will confess. What I have to deny, I will deny." Beatrice was then lowered and untied. A barber reduced the dislocation of her arms in the usual manner. The examination was read over to her, and as she had promised, she made a full confession. After this confession, at the request of the 2 brothers, they were all confined in the same prison. But the next day Giacomo and Bernardo were taken to the cells of Tordenona. As for the women, they remained where they were. The Pope was so horrified on reading the particulars of the crime contained in the confessions that he ordered the culprits to be dragged by wild horses through the streets of Rome. But such a barbarous sentence shocked the public mind, so much so that many persons of princely rank petitioned the Holy Father on their knees, imploring him to reconsider his decree, or at least allow the accused to be heard in their defense. "Tell me," replied Clement VIII, "did they give their unhappy father time to be heard in his own defense, when they slew him in so merciless and degrading a fashion?" At length, overcome by so many entreaties, he respited them for 3 days. The most eloquent and skillful advocates in Rome immediately busied themselves in preparing pleadings for such an emotional case, and on the day fixed for hearing, appeared before His Holiness. The first pleader was Niccolò degli Angeli, who spoke with such force and eloquence that the Pope, alarmed at the effect he was producing among the audience, passionately interrupted him. "Are there then to be found," he indignantly cried, "among the Roman nobility children capable of killing their parents, and among Roman lawyers men capable of speaking in their defense? This is a thing we should never have believed, nor even for a moment supposed it was possible." All were silent upon this terrible rebuke, except Farinacci, who, nerving himself with a strong sense of duty, replied respectfully but firmly, "Most Holy Father, we are not here to defend criminals, but to save the innocent. For if we succeeded in proving that any of the accused acted in self-defense, I hope that they will be exonerated in the eyes of your Holiness. For just as the law provides for cases in which the father may legally kill the child, so this holds good in the converse. We will therefore continue our pleadings on receiving leave from your Holiness to do so." Clement VIII then showed himself as patient as he had previously been hasty, and heard the argument of Farinacci, who pleaded that Francesco Cenci had lost all the rights of a father from the day that he violated his daughter. In support of his contention, he wished to put in the memorial sent by Beatrice to His Holiness, petitioning him, as her sister had done, to remove her from the paternal roof and place her in a convent. Unfortunately, this petition had disappeared, and notwithstanding the minutest search among the papal documents, no trace of it could be found. The Pope collected all the pleadings and dismissed the advocates. Only D'Alteri remained, kneeling before him, saying, "Most Holy Father, I humbly ask pardon for appearing before you in this case, but I am the advocate of the poor and had no choice." The Pope kindly raised him, responding, "Go, we are not surprised at your conduct, but at that of others who protect and defend criminals." Taking great interest in the case, the Pope stayed up all night, studying it with Cardinal di San Marcello, a man of sharp intellect and extensive experience in criminal law. After summarizing the case, he sent a draft of his opinion to the advocates. They read it with satisfaction, hoping the lives of the convicted would be spared. The evidence suggested that even if the children had taken their father's life, all provocation came from him. Beatrice, in particular, had been driven to participate in the crime by her father's tyranny, wickedness, and brutality. Influenced by these considerations, the Pope eased their prison conditions and allowed them to hope their lives would not be forfeited. Amidst public relief over these favors, another tragic event changed the Pope's mind and thwarted his humane intentions. This was the atrocious murder of Marchese di Santa Croce, a 70-year-old man, by his son Paolo. Paolo stabbed him 15 or 20 times because his father refused to promise him sole inheritance. The murderer fled and escaped. Clement VIII was horrified by the increasing frequency of parricide. For the moment, however, he could not act, as he had to go to Montecavallo to consecrate a cardinal titular bishop in the church of Santa Maria degli Angeli. But the following day, Friday, September 10th, 1599, at 8 in the morning, he summoned Monsignor Taverna, governor of Rome, and instructed him, "Monsignor, we place the Cenci case in your hands, that you may carry out the sentence as speedily as possible." Upon returning to his palace after leaving His Holiness, the governor convened all the criminal judges in the city. Their counsel resulted in all the Cenci being condemned to death. The final sentence was immediately known. As this unhappy family inspired ever-increasing interest, many cardinals spent the entire night, either on horseback or in their carriages, appealing for the women to be executed privately within the prison. They also sought a free pardon for Bernardo, a poor lad of only 15, who, though innocent of any participation in the crime, found himself entangled in its consequences. Cardinal Sforza showed the most interest, but failed to elicit a single gleam of hope, so unyielding was His Holiness. At last Farinacci, appealing to the papal conscience, succeeded after long and urgent pleas, and only at the final moment, in sparing Bernardo's life. From Friday evening, members of the Conforteria Brotherhood had gathered at the two prisons of Corte Sevella and Tordenona. Preparations for the tragedy's final scene had occupied workmen on the bridge of Sant' Angelo all night. It was not until 5 o'clock in the morning that the registrar entered the cells of Lucrezia and Beatrice to read their sentences. Both were sleeping, calm in the belief of a reprieve. The registrar woke them, informing them that, judged by man, they must now prepare to appear before God. Beatrice was initially thunderstruck, appearing paralyzed and speechless. Then she rose from bed, staggering as if intoxicated, before recovering her speech, uttering despairing cries. Lucrezia received the news with more firmness and began to dress for the chapel, urging Beatrice to resign. But Beatrice, raving, wrung her hands and struck her head against the wall, shrieking, "To die! To die! Am I to die unprepared, on a scaffold? On a gibbet? My God! My God!" This fit led to a terrible paroxysm, after which the exhaustion of her body allowed her mind to regain its balance. From that moment, she became an angel of humility and an example of resignation. Her first request was for a notary to make her will. This was immediately granted, and upon his arrival, she dictated its provisions with great calmness and precision. Its last clause requested her interment in the church of San Pietro in Montorio, to which she always had a strong attachment, as it overlooked her father's palace. She bequeathed 500 crowns to the nuns of the Order of the Stigmata and ordered her dowry, amounting to 15,000 crowns, to be distributed as marriage portions to 50 poor girls. She selected the foot of the high altar as her burial place, beneath the beautiful painting of the Transfiguration, which she had often admired during her life. Following her example, Lucrezia, in her turn, disposed of her property. She desired to be buried in the church of San Giorgio di Vallobra and left 32,000 crowns to charities, along with other pious legacies. Having settled their earthly affairs, they joined in prayer, reciting psalms, litanies, and prayers for the dying. At 8 o'clock, they confessed, heard Mass, and received the sacraments. Afterward, Beatrice, observing to her stepmother that their rich dresses were out of place on a scaffold, ordered 2 to be made in the fashion of a nun's habit, gathered at the neck, with long, wide sleeves. Lucrezia's was made of black cotton, Beatrice's of taffeta. Additionally, Beatrice had a small black turban made for her head. These dresses, with cords for girdles, were brought to them and placed on a chair while the women continued to pray. As the appointed time drew near, they were informed that their last moment was approaching. Then Beatrice, still on her knees, rose with a tranquil and almost joyful countenance. "Mother," she said, "the moment of our suffering is impending. I think we had better dress in these clothes and help one another at our toilet for the last time." They then put on the provided dresses, girded themselves with the cords. Beatrice placed her turban on her head, and they awaited the final summons. Meanwhile, Giacomo and Bernardo, whose sentences had been read to them, also awaited their moment of death. Around 10 o'clock, members of the Confraternity of Mercy, a Florentine order, arrived at the Tordinona prison. They halted on the threshold with the crucifix, awaiting the appearance of the unhappy youths. Here, a serious accident nearly occurred. As many people were at the prison windows to see the prisoners emerge, someone accidentally threw down a large flower pot full of earth, which fell into the street and narrowly missed one of the confraternity members among the torchbearers just before the crucifix. It passed so close to the torch that it extinguished the flame in its descent. At this moment, the gates opened, and Giacomo appeared first on the threshold. He fell to his knees, adoring the holy crucifix with great devotion. He was completely covered with a large mourning cloak, beneath which his bare breast was prepared to be torn by the executioner's red-hot pincers, lying ready in a chafing dish fixed to the cart. After he ascended the vehicle, where the executioner positioned him for this task, Bernardo came out. Upon his appearance, the fiscal of Rome addressed him. "Signor Bernardo Cenci, in the name of our blessed Redeemer, our Holy Father the Pope spares your life, with the sole condition that you accompany your relatives to the scaffold and to their death. And never forget to pray for those with whom you were condemned to die." At this unexpected news, a loud murmur of joy spread through the crowd. The confraternity members immediately untied the small mask covering the youth's eyes, as, due to his tender age, it had been deemed proper to conceal the scaffold from his sight. Then the executioner, having prepared Giacomo, descended from the cart to attend to Bernardo. Once his pardon was formally communicated, the executioner removed his handcuffs and placed him alongside his brother, covering him with a magnificent cloak embroidered with gold. The poor lad's neck and shoulders had already been bared as a preliminary to decapitation. People were surprised to see such a rich cloak in the executioner's possession, but were told it was the one Beatrice had given to Marzio to secure his pledge for her father's murder, which fell to the executioner as a perquisite after the assassin's execution. The sight of the vast assembly of people had such an effect on the boy that he fainted. The procession then proceeded to the prison of Corte Sevella, marching to the sound of funeral chants. At its gates, the sacred crucifix halted for the women to join. They soon appeared, fell on their knees, and worshipped the holy symbol as the others had done. The march to the scaffold then resumed. The 2 female prisoners followed the last row of penitents in single file, veiled to the waist. Lucrezia, as a widow, wore a black veil and high-heeled slippers of the same hue, with ribbon bows, as was the fashion. Beatrice, as a young unmarried girl, wore a silk flat cap matching her corsage, with a plush hood that fell over her shoulders and covered her violet frock. She wore white slippers with high heels, ornamented with gold rosettes and cherry-colored fringe. The arms of both were unrestrained, except for a thin, slack cord that left their hands free to carry a crucifix and a handkerchief. During the night, a lofty scaffold had been erected on the bridge of Sant Angelo, with the plank and block placed upon it. Above the block, from a large cross beam, hung a ponderous axe which, guided by two grooves, fell with its full weight at the touch of a spring. In this formation, the procession made its way toward the bridge of Sant Angelo. Lucrezia, more broken than Beatrice, wept bitterly. Beatrice, however, remained firm and unmoved. Upon reaching the open space before the bridge, the women were led into a chapel, where Giacomo and Bernardo soon joined them. They remained together for a few moments before the brothers were led to the scaffold, though one was to be executed last and the other pardoned. When they mounted the platform, Bernardo fainted a second time. As the executioner approached to assist him, some in the crowd, believing he intended to decapitate the boy, cried loudly, "He is pardoned." The executioner reassured them by seating Bernardo near the block, with Giacomo kneeling on the other side. The executioner then descended, entered the chapel, and reappeared leading Lucrezia, who was the first to suffer. At the foot of the scaffold, he tied her hands behind her back, tore open the top of her corsage to expose her shoulders, gave her the crucifix to kiss, and led her to the step ladder. She ascended with great difficulty, due to her extreme stoutness. Upon reaching the platform, he removed the veil covering her head. As her features were revealed to the immense crowd, Lucrezia shuddered from head to foot. Then, her eyes full of tears, she cried with a loud voice, "O my God, have mercy upon me, and you, brethren, pray for my soul." Having uttered these words, unsure of what was required, she turned to Alessandro, the chief executioner, and asked what to do. He told her to bestride the plank and lie prone upon it. This she did with great trouble and timidity. However, due to the fullness of her bust, she was unable to lay her neck upon the block, which had to be raised by placing a billet of wood underneath it. All this time, the poor woman, suffering more from shame than fear, remained in suspense. At last, properly adjusted, the executioner touched the spring. The knife fell, and the decapitated head, landing on the scaffold platform, bounced 2 or 3 times in the air, to general horror. The executioner then seized it, showed it to the multitude, and wrapped it in black taffeta, placed it with the body on a bier at the foot of the scaffold. While arrangements were being made for Beatrice's decapitation, several spectator stands collapsed. Some people were killed in this accident, and many more were injured. The machine now rearranged and cleaned, the executioner returned to the chapel for Beatrice. Upon seeing the sacred crucifix, she offered prayers for her soul. When her hands were tied, she cried out, "God grant that you be binding this body unto corruption, and loosing this soul unto life eternal." She then rose, proceeded to the platform, where she devoutly kissed the stigmata. Leaving her slippers at the foot of the scaffold, she nimbly ascended the ladder and, having been instructed beforehand, promptly lay down on the plank without exposing her naked shoulders. But her precautions to shorten the bitterness of death were in vain. The Pope, knowing her impetuous disposition and fearing she might commit some sin between absolution and death, had ordered a signal gun to be fired from the Castel Sant Angelo the moment Beatrice was extended on the scaffold. This was done, to everyone's great astonishment, including Beatrice herself, who, not expecting this explosion, raised herself almost upright. Meanwhile, the Pope, praying at Monte Cavallo, granted her absolution in articulo mortis. About 5 minutes passed, during which the sufferer waited with her head replaced on the block. At length, when the executioner judged that absolution had been given, he released the spring, and the axe fell. A gruesome sight then followed. While the head bounced away on one side of the block, on the other, the body rose erect, as if about to step backward. The executioner exhibited the head and disposed of it, and the body as before. He intended to place Beatrice's body with her stepmother's, but the Brotherhood of Mercy took it from him. As one of them attempted to lay it on the bier, it slipped and fell from the scaffold to the ground below. Her dress was partially torn from the body, which was so besmeared with dust and blood that much time was spent washing it. Poor Bernardo was so overcome by this horrible scene that he swooned for the 3rd time and required stimulants to revive him to witness his elder brother's fate. Giacomo's turn finally arrived. He had witnessed the death of his stepmother and sister, and his clothes were covered with their blood. The executioner approached him and tore off his cloak, exposing his bare breast, covered with wounds from the red-hot pincers. In this state, half-naked, he rose to his feet and, turning to his brother, said, "Bernardo, if in my examination I have compromised and accused you, I have done so falsely. Although I have already disavowed this declaration, I repeat, at the moment of appearing before God, that you are innocent, and that it is a cruel abuse of justice to compel you to witness this frightful spectacle." The executioner then made him kneel down, bound his legs to one of the beams on the scaffold, and having bandaged his eyes, shattered his head with a blow of his mallet. Then, in full view of all, he hacked his body into 4 quarters. The official party then departed, taking Bernardo, who, in a state of high fever, was bled and put to bed. The corpses of the 2 ladies were laid out on their biers under the statue of St. Paul, at the foot of the bridge, with 4 torches of white wax, which burned until 4 in the afternoon. Then, along with Giacomo's remains, they were taken to the church of San Giovanni Decollato. Finally, around 9 in the evening, Beatrice's body, covered with flowers and dressed in the attire worn at her execution, was carried to the church of San Pietro in Montorio with 50 lighted torches, followed by the brethren of the Order of the Stigmata and all the Franciscan monks in Rome. There, according to her wish, it was buried at the foot of the high altar. That same evening, Signora Lucrezia was interred, as she had desired, in the church of San Giorgio di Vallobra. It can be said that all of Rome was present at this tragedy. Carriages, horses, pedestrians, and carts crowded upon one another. The day was unfortunately so hot, and the sun so scorching, that many people fainted. Others returned home stricken with fever, and some even died during the night due to sunstroke from exposure during the 3 hours of the execution. The following Tuesday, September 14th, the Feast of the Holy Cross, the Brotherhood of San Marcello, by special license of the Pope, set the unhappy Bernardo Cenci at liberty. The condition was that he pay 2,500 Roman crowns within the year to the Brotherhood of the Most Holy Trinity of Pope Sixtus, a record that can still be found in their archives today. Now that you have seen the tomb, if you wish to form a more vivid impression of the principal actors in this tragedy than can be derived from a narrative, visit the Barberini Gallery. There, among 5 other masterpieces by Guido, you will see the portrait of Beatrice. Some say it was painted the night before her execution, others during her procession to the scaffold. It depicts the head of a lovely girl wearing a headdress composed of a turban with a lappet. Her hair is a rich, fair chestnut hue. Her dark eyes are moistened with recent tears. A perfectly framed nose surmounts an infantile mouth. Unfortunately, the picture's loss of tone since it was painted has destroyed the original fair complexion. The subject's age may be 20, or perhaps 22 years. Near this portrait is that of Lucrezia Petrani. The small head suggests a person of below-average height. Her attributes are those of a Roman matron in her pride. Her high complexion, graceful contour, straight nose, black eyebrows, and an expression both imperious and voluptuous vividly convey this character. A smile still seems to linger on the charming, dimpled cheeks and perfect mouth mentioned by the chronicler, and her face is exquisitely framed by luxuriant curls falling from her forehead in graceful profusion. As for Giacomo and Bernardo, since no portraits of them exist, we must gather an idea of their appearance from the manuscript that has allowed us to compile this sanguinary history. They are thus described by an eyewitness of the closing scene. Giacomo was short, well-built, and strong, with black hair and beard. He appeared to be about 26 years of age. Poor Bernardo was the image of his sister, so closely resembling her that when he mounted the scaffold, his long hair and girlish face led people to suppose him to be Beatrice herself. He might have been 14 or 15 years of age. The peace of God be with them.